I am going to read you a story, and it is a story that is a favourite of mine since I was a little girl, and it is called Tom Thumb. There was once an ordinary woodcutter and his wife who had an extraordinary son. He was no bigger than a man's thumb, but they loved him enormously. And because of his size, they named him Tom Thumb. And no matter how much his mother fed him, Tom never grew any taller. His parents were anxious that being so small might prevent him from doing the things other children did. But Tom wasn't going to let his size get in the way of an adventure. He used a walnut shell as a canoe and a teaspoon as a paddle. He built himself a go-kart from a matchbox with buttons for wheels. He even tamed a field mouse and made a little saddle for it so he could go out riding. One morning, Tom Thumb's father was getting ready to go to work. "Please, could you bring me the cart when you've finished with it?" he asked his wife. "Oh, Mother's so busy," said Tom. "Why don't I bring it to you?" And the woodcutter smiled at his son. "That's very kind of you, Tom, but you're far too small to lead a horse by the reins." "That doesn't matter," said the boy. "I can sit in its ear and tell it which way to go." "Very well," said the woodcutter. "Let's give it a try." And so, when it was time to go, Tom's mother lifted him up into the horse's ear. "Giddy up," he called, and the horse trotted obediently along the track. And they hadn't gone very far when they drove past two men from the circus, the ringmaster and a clown. The circus men were surprised to see a horse and cart go by without a driver. They were even more startled when the horse seemed to call out, "Giddy up, giddy up." "Oh, I've never seen anything like it," exclaimed the clown. "Was that a talking horse?" "It must be some magic trick," said the ringmaster. "Let's follow and find out." Tom Thumb drove on until he came to the spot where his father was working. "Here I am, Father," he called. "I've brought you the cart, just as promised." "Oh, well done, Tom," said the woodcutter, holding out his hand next to the horse's ear. Watching from behind a bush, the circus men could scarcely believe their eyes as they watched the tiniest boy they'd ever seen hop onto the palm of the woodcutter's hand. "Oh, did you see that?" asked the clown excitedly. "We'd make a fortune if we had that boy in our show." Oh, the ringmaster rubbed his hands together greedily. "Yes, people would pay big money to see a boy that small," he agreed. So the men strode over to the woodcutter. "Please allow us to introduce ourselves," began the ringmaster with a theatrical bow. "We are performers from the circus, and we couldn't help noticing that you have an unusually small son. He'd fit perfectly into our act." But I don't," began the woodcutter. "Just think," the clown interrupted him. "With us he could become a huge star. He could travel the world and see his name in lights." The ringmaster dug into his pocket and pulled out a bag of gold coins. "Of course we'll make it worth your while," he said, jangling the coins. "What? Sell my son?" cried the woodcutter. "His mother and I wouldn't part with him for all the riches in the world." But Tom sensed an opportunity and he climbed up his father's sleeve and whispered in his ear. "Well, we really do need the money," he said. "Let me go with these jokers, and I'll be back home before you know it. I promise." Well, the woodcutter couldn't help worrying about his son, but he knew he could take care of himself, so he took the bag of gold and said goodbye to Tom. And with a satisfied smirk, the ringmaster put Tom on the brim of his top hat, and they set off. They walked all afternoon with Tom jingling along the ringmaster's hat and whistling as he enjoyed the view. And the light was starting to fade when they came to a crossroad. "Please may I get down for a moment?" Tom Thumb called. "I need to stretch my legs." "Very well," said the ringmaster, setting the boy down on the side of the road. "Thanks for the ride," Tom called merrily, and he darted straight down a mouse hole. "Hey, what do you think you're doing?" yelled the clown. "Come out of there, you little rascal," shouted the ringmaster furiously. The circus men poked twigs down the mouse hole to try and force Tom out, but he just crawled further and further and further in, out of reach. By nightfall, the men had to admit defeat. "Oh, it's no use, we've lost him," the ringmaster sighed, "and all of our gold too." "Well, I can't believe you fell for his trick," cried the clown. "You're meant to be the clever one." "Well, you didn't help much," retorted the ringmaster. Tom listened to the two men bickering as they trudged home empty-handed. He was just wondering what to do next, when a family of angry mice came and chased him out of the hole. Outside, it was too dark for him to find his way home, so he looked around for somewhere to spend the night. He spotted an empty snail shell. "Well, that'll do nicely," he thought. So with some moss for a pillow and a leaf for a cover, he curled up inside the shell. He was just drifting off to sleep when he heard voices overhead, so he peered out to see who it was. A spotty youth, clutching a big, bulging sack, was talking to an older man. "Who are we going to rob next, Dad?" asked the youth. "Well, there's a wealthy old priest who lives down the road," his father replied. "Let's try him." Tom was shocked. "I can't let these two scoundrels rob a priest," he thought. So he got out of the snail shell and followed them. The robbers tiptoed around the priest's house, looking for a way to break in. "The doors have got strong locks in them, and there are iron bars in all of the windows," muttered the youth. "How are we going to get in?" "I'll help you," Tom called up. "Who's there?" whispered the youth. "Where are you?" hissed the robber. "I'm down here," called Tom. The robbers looked down, stifling gasps of amazement. "What a tiny boy," they exclaimed. "My name's Tom Thumb," said the boy. "I can easily slip into the priest's house for you and get whatever you want." "Well, you could certainly come in handy," agreed the robber. So he lifted Tom up onto the kitchen window ledge. Tom slipped through the iron bars and jumped down onto the kitchen table. And from there he leapt onto a chair and slid down one of its legs to the floor. And then at the top of his little lungs he yelled, "I'm in the house now. What do you want me to steal?" "Oh, keep your voice down," hissed the robber through the window. "You'll wake everyone up." But instead, Tom Thumb shouted even louder, "There are some fancy silver spoons here," he cried. "Do you want me to pass them out to you through the window?" This time the cook woke up. She sprang out of her bed. She rushed to the kitchen, grabbing a rolling pin to fight off the intruder. "Run!" cried the robber, and he and his son escaped into the night. Tom hurriedly climbed back up the chair and onto the table, but the window was too high for him to reach. The cook looked around the room. "Who's there?" she called bravely, but she was looking for a thumb-sized boy, so she didn't notice Tom, who quickly hid under a teacup. "I must have been dreaming," she thought, and she went back to bed. Tom was so worn out from his adventures that he curled up under the teacup and fell fast asleep. When he woke up, it was morning. The cook was already up and busy in the kitchen. Tom crawled out from under the teacup and looked for a way to escape. But at that very moment, the kitchen cat looked up and spotted him. Thinking Tom was a mouse, the cat sprang onto the chair and swiped a paw at the boy. Just in time, Tom ducked out of the way and hurled himself off the side of the table. He had no choice but to run for the door. But he was only halfway across the room when a gigantic broom knocked him off his feet. The cook had started sweeping the floor. She swept Tom into a bucket full of scraps, which she carried into the yard and tipped down to a heap of kitchen waste. Tom fought his way out from under a pile of potato peelings, only to find himself nose to nose with a scavenging wolf. It stared at him hungrily and bared its razor-sharp teeth. And before Tom could dive out of the way, the wolf snapped him up and swallowed him whole. Sitting in the pit of the wolf's stomach, Tom was surrounded by all sorts of disgusting things. The wolf had eaten, and it gave him an idea. "Mr. Wolf," he called, "it's me, the little boy you just ate." "Be quiet," grumbled the wolf. "I'm trying to eat." "Well, I'm rather hungry myself," said Tom, "but I don't fancy any of the food here in your stomach. And I know a place where you can feast on steaks and cheese and pies instead of scraps." The wolf's mouth began to water. "Where is this place?" he asked greedily. "I'll take you there," replied Tom. "Just follow my directions." So he described the way to his own house, and the wolf set off at a trot, driven by the thought of the delicious meal waiting at the other end. When they reached his house, Tom directed the wolf to the back door and into the larder off the kitchen. And just as he promised, the shelves were stacked with meats and cheeses. A freshly baked pie was cooling on a rack, filling the room with the aroma of soft, buttery pastry. The wolf opened his jaws wide, and it was about to sink his teeth into the pie when Tom Thumb began to howl with all his might. "Stop that," growled the wolf. "The owner of the house will hear." But of course, that was exactly what Tom Thumb wanted. So he kept on yelling until his parents came running. And when the woodcutter caught sight of the wolf, he grabbed his shotgun. "Stand back," he told his wife, and he took aim. "Be careful, Father," Tom shouted. "It's me, your son. The wolf has eaten me, and I am inside his stomach." The woodcutter carefully lowered his gun, and the wolf tried to run past him. But thinking fast, Tom's mother seized a frying pan from the stove. She beat the wolf over the head and knocked it dead. The woodcutter took out his hunting knife and carefully sliced open the beast's belly, and out hopped Tom Thumb. "Tom, we've been so worried about you," his mother cried, stroking his hair with her little finger. "Where have you been?" asked his father. "I have been on an incredible adventure," Tom Thumb began. "I've been down a mouse hole, slept in a snail shell, foiled some robbers, been chased by a cat and a broom, and eaten by a greedy wolf. But I am so glad to be home, and I don't think I'll be going on any more adventures for a long, long while."